Good morning. We're in the middle of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, Mika Hashem Alekenu, on page 375. 375, Shin Ayin Hey. The Maimer began on 361. This is Maamorei AdHamtz Bereishis. There's a whole set, a series which was printed relatively later, of the Maamorim of the Mittler Rebbe. There are many Maamorim of the Mittler Rebbe that he himself, the Mittler Rebbe himself, published in his time, like Teres Chaim, Teres Reish, Im Rebina, the Sha'orim, like Shari Eire, Shari Yichud, Shari Spilus, Shari Tshuva, many others. Mittler Rebbe himself published, Biri Azeyar, the Siddur. And then there's Maamorei AdHamtz. It's a series of Maamorim that he delivered and he wrote, which were not published at the time. They were published in later years as the manuscripts started collecting and accumulating. And so these Maamorim, as most cases, are based on a Maimer from the Alter Rebbe and elaborated upon in Mittler Rebbe style. And this is the Chanukah Maimer. We talked about the Chanukah Tovkuf Samach Vav from the Alter Rebbe, which we learned in Torah Eir, the Maimer and its beard, an explanation. And now we're learning the Mittler Rebbe's elaboration of that Maimer, which was said in Tov Kuf Pei Vov or Pei Zayin, either 20 years later or 21 years later from when the Alter Rebbe first said it. And that is the basis of a large part of the base and foundational text upon which the end of Ayin Beis is based. And namely, the process of transforming the animal soul through the divine soul's work, and specifically through davening, and in davening itself, focus on Shema, how the contemplation on Achdus Hashem, the Yichud, mitzvahs Yichud, which is so foundational in Judaism in general, like you said, you say Kol HaMitzvahs, by contemplating on that, and all the details, that in turn impacts and has the power to cause that V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, which follows Shema, is b'shnei levavcha, b'chol levavcha rather, b'shnei yitzarecha, with all your heart, which means with all parts of your heart, the emotional, the right side and the left side, as explained in Tanya, that the nefesh elokis is in the right side, the nefesh habam is the left side. So all the heart, the person's entire emotions and passions are directed toward godliness instead of it being a battle with animals. The divine soul wants godliness, transcendence, and the animal soul wants its own selfish desires. But we'll get to that. And in Ayin Beis, he never gets back to the nefesh habamis effect. He only talks about the hisbonenus. But the Mittler Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe do discuss it, so it's all going to help us understand the whole picture. So right now we're in the middle of, or the beginnings of the hisbonenus of Yichud Hashem, and specifically the topic of Yesh Ma'ayin versus Yesh Miyesh, which I'll sum up shortly. Before I do that, I wanted to just add one more thing. In the context of the conclusion of Ayin Beis, so obviously this topic is all part of the central theme of Ayin Beis, which is interface, the interface between divine and existence. In personal terms, as the interface between your divine soul and your animal soul. Because that's where the challenge is. That's where the dichotomy exists, the dissonance, the two different consciousness. And we want to integrate them in the language that he used earlier in Ayin Beis in volume 2, that we want to be able to experience pre-Tzimtzum consciousness, which is total and absolute divine awareness. There's nothing but Elokus into post-Tzimtzum reality. And a post-Tzimtzum reality is a Tzimtzum that conceals. And he actually used the word Tzimtzum in our personal lives is the Nefesh Habamis. A manifestation of the Tzimtzum is our animal soul, because how could our animal soul be pursuing other interests that are not godly if there's only one God and that's the only reality? Is because the Tzimtzum conceals that fact and allows and creates an environment and room for another consciousness to emerge and ultimately for the Nefesh Habamis to do its work. So in a way, the central theme of interface, both on a cosmic and macrocosmic level, and a microcosmic level, is the theme of Ayin Beis in general, And as I pointed out many times, it's really the theme of Chassidus in general, and it's really the theme of all Yiddishkeit, all Torah in general. Like he says here, mitzvahs yichud. So it's not surprising that as Ayin Beis comes to a conclusion, even though the Rebbe Rashab didn't actually finish it, but it's clearly definitely we're on the so-called closing end of the Hemshech, that it should conclude with yichud, because that is the theme of Ayin Beis. Ultimately, the yichud of all the levels, like he says specifically, yichud tata, yichud ilah, and the yichud of those both yichudim, as he begins to explain on page 1466, and then continues on the next 11 pages until the conclusion of Ayin Beis. So as we're learning all this from the Mittler Rebbe, I'm very personally cognizant all the time that we're actually learning Ayin Beis with a background and with a context that the Mittler Rebbe is providing to help us understand Ayin Beis. So I look at this as an Ayin Beis class, not a Mittler Rebbe's class, even though it is both. In fact, all the Rabbeim are one. So it's not, there's no competition here. But in truth is the reason we're learning this is because this will help enrich and understand the Ayin Beis more completely. Both the background and the context, and the background and more details, as well as where it's going to conclude as we go back to once you have this isbodnus, the effect on the animal soul. We still have to get to Ner Mitzvah V'Torah, which we haven't even touched on now in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimed, that is, and then back to the Hariyah, and back to what Torah is in contrast to Tefillah, and all the things I pointed out when before we began learning these Maamorim and the Torah Shalom. I pointed out a bunch of things in Ayin Beis that are not finished. So all this is going to help us also tie up the knots on those themes as well. So just reminding us all of our a little context and perspective here, and then we'll continue. I'll now sum up what we learned in the last class. Okay. So, somebody wants to say something or ask something? Fine.
Which page?
I didn't start learning yet. We're up to page 375, but I'm summing up now, basically 374, 375, which we learned in the last class. So, the theme is this. The question is this. I'm using his actual words. Ma'ayin yesh keach la'adam, sheyavel lemadrei gdel kazez benefesh alikis, ad sheyuchel hapich, gam ha'keich nefesh habam is besechel midas sheba, af meral tev. From where does the power of the human being have the power to come to this level? Remember, the nefesh alikis, nefesh habam are diametric opposites, as we learned at length. They have very different interests. Not just different interests, opposite interests. He said clearly, hafochim, to the point that it's from the wonders of God that he brings them together. When he brings them together, it's not just that they coexist or that they even don't coexist, they battle with each other, then they actually have the power to transform the animal soul. So the question is how? How do you do that? With the animal soul, I mean, in a very simple Balbatisha terms, you're a teacher in a classroom, or you have children, or you have people you're trying to inspire, and they're completely interested in materialism. I'm sure you've met people like that. They're not interested in spirituality. They're not interested in God. They're not interested in anything of higher purpose. So usually we say, okay, listen, I tried my best, and some people just, their head is in another place. But being that every human being is created in the divine image, and everyone has a neshama, we believe that every person can be reached. The question is, what method can you use to affect that person? And in our case, also to affect the person with that voice within you called the animal soul that's interested in materialism. It's interested in its own self-interest and its own pleasure and so on. So it's a big question. This question was asked in Torah as well, as I pointed out, by the Alter Rebbe, well, as well. It began with the Maimon Alter Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe has in his language, he actually points out the question several different times, I think 3 different times, if I recall. The bottom of page 363, top of 372, and now here on and then which we just hear, and page 374 is going to repeats it again. So that's why I'll use the Ayin Beis language, since we're looking at Ayin Beis. He says, Before that, he asks, how is it b'koyach haneshama? So, therefore, and he begins to explain, that's why Anshe Knesset Agdela gave us davening. We're not talking about the minimum davening midaraisa in Torah, which is for your needs. Big part of davening is not just needs. Psukkah de Zimri, you're not talking about your needs. It's not Refer Chelim, and it's not all the Shemoneh Esrei brachas that are all about our needs, or in most cases, most of our needs. So why would they masakin it? God doesn't need our praises. It's because that is ultimately the work of Veda Shebelev, Zuhi Tfilah, to refine the animal soul. That's what he made very clear here. This is actually from the Alter Rebbe, but here he says clearly, Anshe Knesset Agdela, and the Rebbe Rashab cites that line, as I pointed out when we learned in the previous classes. And he began first, Psukkah de Zimra. Then he went to Birchas Yetzer and Birchas Avasel and Birchas Krishma. Shnayim Lefaneha, the two blessings before Shema. But the main place, as he puts it, he says, is in Krishma. It's Zeu Kol HaMitzvah the Krishma. But you can't, like anything, it's step by step by step. You don't just jump in, especially when you're dealing with a battle, like an animal soul, you can't just do it quickly. So that's why tefillah is like a runway, if you wish, or like a ladder, which we climb step by step. Each step helps us acclimate and ultimately educate, inspire, get the attention of the animal soul. And Shema is the primary place. The Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is going to be the main focus here. That is bonus and Achdus Hashem, Yichud, Mitzvah Yichud as he calls it, is also such that can be explained to the animal soul. Because remember, as I explained, the point here is that the animal soul should understand with its own seichel, with human intelligence, and with its emotions, human emotions, that are usually reserved for its own interests, that it should appreciate and ultimately internalize and integrate, like he said, Shema Loshen Havana Havchana Teva, that appreciate that really all its entire existence is all part of godliness. And the true reality is God. So to convince the animal soul, first of all, you don't need to convince to convince the divine soul, you don't need to convince the divine soul. That's its matter. Like we learned, the divine soul it's makar chetzva. The way it's rooted in Elokus. So the consciousness of the divine soul is all divine. The challenge is he says, the Neshama didn't come down, however, for its own self. It came down, the Neshama doesn't need tikkun. It came down to be Mesakin the Nefesh HaBamis. The Nefesh HaBamis does need convincing and explanation. So now what we're learning, as we learned in Ayin Beis, is an elaborate contemplation of Shema, basically. So the next few pages are dedicated completely in understanding Yichud. And the first thing the Mittler Rebbe began with is understanding it in context of the juxtaposition, I should say, the contrast is the word I was looking for, between godliness and existence. So how is he explaining it? In the context of its relationship. What is the relationship between the creator and the creation? That's the first place to begin. You want to try to convince the creation that's driven by self-interest, the Nefesh HaBamis, namely. Then you have to first understand what's the relationship between creator and creation. And so an animal soul, that's an intelligent animal soul, would be very intrigued by that. You're not just explaining, because it's an intriguing concept. Where did I come from? What created me? So what is the relationship between creator and creation? So the first thing that Mittler Rebbe established, it's not yesh miyesh, it's yesh ma'ayin. Not like the mistake of the philosophers and some of the Mukabalim Rishenim. And I looked it up, so I know what he's referring to. It was correct what I said in the last class. I just wanted to confirm it inside. We'll get to that in a few minutes. So what their mistake is that there's a common denominator, ilav olol, yesh miyesh. Yesh miyesh is defined by the fact that one yesh, even if it originates from a previous yesh, they still have something in common. And the second difference is it creates a shinui and hispilus in the original one. You take water from a pitcher into a cup, there's a change in the original water. It shifts. A teacher teaches intelligence to a student. He exerts himself. And at the time that he's doing it, he can't be doing something else. And he may even get tired from it. So bottom line is yesh mi-yesh, and whereas creation is yesh ma'ayin. And yesh ma'ayin is distinguished in these two ways. The other, number one, yesh and ayin have nothing in common. There's no shishtabus and dimyan behem klal, like he put it. And number two, the yesh does not affect the ayin. And it's habatay. Because of its distance, it's removed from it. So even though there's a koich hapel benifel, and God invests himself, and that's why there is a level of godliness that does relate to existence, and that's where the Mekubal and Rishonim they talk about. But the emes, like he put it, the emes, God is not affected by creation, like he said, Ani Hashem leishanisi. I do not change. And atahu mishanivre elam, atahu shlach mishanivre elam. The same ata. You are the one that was before existence, and you're the same person, or not person. Sorry. The same entity after existence. Wrong word. Okay. So with that said, that is the distinction. That's the first thing that the Mittler Rebbe establishes. And that is on page, if you want to know the exact pages 374 and 375, where we're up to now. And I just want to, let me just make sure I covered everything I wanted to cover. Yeah. He actually gave us several examples of yesh mi-yesh. 4, namely. He gave 4 examples. One is the example of Talmud Shemekabel Seichel Merabe. Did he begin with that one? Yeah. A student and a teacher. The second example was the sun and the moon. The third example was Mayim, Shefa Mayim, water from one keli to another. And the fourth example was Asher La'ani. When a person gives money or helps the wealthy one be mashpia to the less wealthy, to the poor one. So basically in all of these, you find that he's engaging with it. There's something in common. And therefore there's also a shinu v'isparos. I mentioned Shemesh and Levana, you maybe could say there's no shinu in the light of the sun. But that's so relevant to our discussion here, because bottom line, they still have something in common. Mashpia Mekabel. That is the Erech Yishtav, that's yesh mi-yesh el v'ol. The ef shalem kedug mezu lamayla be'inyan isavas and nevroim, says the Mittler Rebbe on top of 375. You can't apply these examples or this example to creation. That the im came because there's nothing in common. Because if there was something in common, then if Eibishter is bligvul, then whatever he creates should also be in common with him, should also be bligvul. And we see the difference between the infinite and the finite. And the same thing regarding shinui. There would have to be a shinui in him if he was engaged in that way. Right? That's one thing. There's a shinui if they are commensurate to each other. So the commensurate between each other is only if you say it's yesh mi-yesh, but not yesh ma'ayin. And he can then elaborate a bit more that when a person invests himself, not just your keiches to build something, but also your intelligence, he says you're engaged in it, he's torud b'zeh, and it's not the same as when you're not concentrating on it. And the proof is that afterwards, when you stop thinking about and focusing on this creation, whether building a house, building a building, he said, or writing something, or a tziyur, drawing an image, there's a tzimtzum, your seichel is being mitzamtzum and diminishing itself as it enters into the product that you're producing. And lamayla lo yitaken leimer shini klal ben kedem amshacha to the after ani Hashem leishanisi atu mishanivre. And then he explained the last thing we learned, that these kushis, these questions that he mentioned before about creation and creator, that would only apply the Svara some, according to their Svara, that the Hisavas came ilaval. You can't find them that type of commensurate relationship because ein arech between Alakus and Nevroim, and therefore the creation is also only coming from a reflection. I think we stopped here. We stopped by the parentheses. Yeah, but I'll go over that anyway. I'm reading on the lower part of the page, 375. Yeah, we stopped there. Okay. Let me just say one more thing about the philosophers, and then we can continue learning inside. So, in Ayin Beis, just for comparative purposes, he mentioned the philosophers too, both on top of page 1467, as well as later, I believe, where is it? Yeah, at the bottom of 1471. So clearly, the Rebbe Rashab, though he doesn't mention Mukabalim Rishenim, but he does mention the philosophers. And he said that it's Shazeu Tosa, the mistake of the philosophers, that they considered creation as something like B'derech Ilav Ol, Mahus L'Mahus, where there's something cause and effect. Like you say, the first cause. In Aristotelian philosophy, for example, God is the first cause. So yes, he's the first cause. So he's the creator, but he's still a cause and effect, and therefore there's a relationship between the two. And then again, he mentions, as I said, bottom of 1471, he says, and here he alludes to the questions I just read. He says, the Mishum Zeh Hukshalahem. Because the philosophers saw existence as being like human creations, yesh miyesh, one object to another, that's why Hukshalem inyan hashina v'espilus. That's why it bothers them. Why is there no shina and espilus in God? Why? Because if it's yesh miyesh, we know anything that's commensurate to another, there should be a change in the first entity as it produces the second entity. And it also should show there should be something similar. So the Rebbe Rashab continues, the Eina Emes came. Basically similar language as the Mittler Rebbe. I'm just comparing Ayin Beis now to the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. Ki'im sheklos shtas b'sav zum ayin, and b'chinas ha'orel levad min ha'atzmus. While Cain, in Atzmus, there's no shinu klal l'klal. Ve'ein arech klal l'klal. At the Kodesh he brings some more proofs. But basically, yeah. And that's where he brings that there's no change, and there's also no change, not just in the etzem, but also in the oir. The oir aliki also is not affected by change. Okay. So, that's for comparative purposes. Now, what about the Mukabal Mushenim? So I looked up the sources that they cite. The Maimonim of the Alter Rebbe, namely, another Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, El-Kut Teira. I didn't look up the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. It's the only thing I didn't have a chance to look up. So briefly, it's as I explained it. Mukabal Mushenim there, it seems like he's referring to Ramak, Ramoshe Karaviro. Sometimes Mukabal Mushenim means even earlier generations, but compared to the Arizal, even though the Ramak was a contemporary of the Arizal, but often he's called more Mukabal Rishenim, meaning an earlier, the earlier Kabbalists, and the Arizal would be the Pesach Achron, so to speak, the final say. So the key thing to keep in mind, and I don't want to really elaborate much about this, but since it's mentioned, I do want to explain what he means. As I pointed out a number of times, a big question in Kabbalah, that Chassidus, of course, discusses, is the relationship between God and existence. Because on one hand, you want to have Achdus. You want to have that there should be godliness, should be manifest in this world. No one can disagree with that pasuk. that God wants to be manifest. Migdash built for me a temple. By Matan Torah, God appeared in some way, manifest in existence. So if we didn't have that issue that God manifests in existence, then it's relatively easier to explain. Okay, God is removed. He created a world. Think of it like a great king built an empire, and he remains aloof in his own palace, and he doesn't have a relationship with them. If there's no relationship, there's no issue, because he could be bligvul, he could be infinitely apart from them. He created something for them, that they should have a world of life. They should have kindness, goodness. That challenges, however, the Torah makes it very clear that God wants a relationship with us. And you have things like V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, love God. Das Alekei Avicha, V'yedaita Hayem, know God. As soon as you talk about a creation, understanding its creator and loving its creator, you're not talking about an infinitely distant relationship. If it would just be an Eved and a Melech, like we say, Im Kavodim, but not Im Kabonim, okay, a servant does not have to understand his master. He doesn't have to love his master. He just has to obey. Just follow the laws, the rules. The problem is, the way God wanted it was a relationship. And he created existence with a human being with a divine soul. And he said, I'm giving you my mitzvahs. Like we learned in this. I'm giving you my mitzvahs and my Torah. So that creates a philosophical quandary, a major one. How can there be a relationship between such two opposites? Basically, a Beda, a creator, who's infinite or beyond infinite, a finite mortal world, and all the other differences between them. So that's why there's some Kabbalim who say that there's two dimensions here. The God that is completely beyond us is off limits. That's what we say. You can't see God and live. If you knew him, you would be him. That part is beyond us. But godliness, there's a dimension, what we call mamala kalalmin, where God applied himself and said, I will invest some of my energy into relationship with you. So your relationship is with that level of energy. Obviously, that level is one with the higher level, but that's not our business. That's God's business. It means that we relate to, or to use another way of putting it, there's a machlekes between the Rambam and the Maharal. The Rambam says, Maimonides, Hu Hamada, Hu Yedeya, Hu Yedua. God is one with the knowledge, with the knower, with the thing that's known. And he says in the Hilchos Yesod HaTorah, this is beyond our understanding. We are not one with our knowledge. We are you, and you can know there's a table here. So you're not one with the table, and so on. Okay, comes the Maral and says, 1 second, God is higher than Das. As soon as you say Hu Amada, Hu Yedei, Hu Yedua, you're already applying a definition, an attribute to God, and God is loy in midus klal. Doesn't have any measurement, doesn't have any parameters, doesn't have any definitions. The Alter Rebbe brings this actually in several places, 3 or 4 places in Tanya, in chapter 2 in the Hagah, in chapter 48, 49 in Hagah, in Shayachad Amun in Hagah. That's where he brings that Kabbalah to the Rambam, that what? And so Chassidus is metavich that the Maral and Rambam are talking about 2 different levels. Maral is talking about the levels of the divine that are beyond spirits, beyond Das, and beyond Chachma, and beyond Bina, and so on. The Rambam is talking about the godliness that connects and creates Chachma, Bina, Das. So like he says, Chachma, Kabbalah, Ramak, and also that Izal with Tzimtzum. After the Tzimtzum, you could apply and say there's a relationship between God and his midas, and therefore with us, because we have similar midas. Just as God has Das, he gave us Das. Like he says in Tanya, that our faculties, Nishtal Shalu, evolve from God's faculties. But God doesn't have faculties. That's the higher level. But then there's a relationship. So they're Mekubalim, and namely the Ramak, like in Tanya, like in the Hagah, look in Hagah in chapter 2, that are talking about godliness in the context of Ilav Ol. Not to say God is something in common. There's a dimension, but his relationship with us is one that is more something in common. That's why there's a relationship. It's only the Arizal with its Tzimtzum, and the Ramak Yodam not Tzimtzum, and with all the things that come afterwards in Kabbalah and then in Chassidus, that explains that there is the divine that relates to existence. There's the divine beyond existence. That's why he says be'emes. It's not that way. In the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe, interestingly, he says that the philosophers who said it's yesh miyesh, they were apikursim. They ultimately attributed some form of definition to God. And he says, nevertheless, he says that Ramak, the Mekubolim that held, their idea is similar to their idea. However, it's not coming from a place of, God forbid, lack of Amunah. It's coming from understanding the God as it relates to existence. Anyway, I don't want to go further than this because there's a lot more to be said. But briefly, the bottom line is that there are Mekubal Misham that talk about the relationship level of God. Not to say that's the philosophers, but he does say, the philosophers, V'gam Ksas Mekubal Marishenim. So they talk about that relationship of Ilava'ol Yesh Miyesh. Not to suggest that it's not Yesh Ma'ayin, but the relationship part with a God is on a level of more like Yesh Miyesh. But be'emes, once you know the whole picture, the fact of the matter is that really the relationship is Shalei Berech, Yesh Ma'ayin, but we know that God chose to want to have a relationship, and that's why ultimately we do have one. But it's not because we have something in common, it's because God gave us tools to relate to Him. Gave us Torah, He gave us mitzvahs, He gave us a neshama. As we learn, Ner Hashem Nishmasadam, Ner Mitzvah V'Teirah. These are infused imbued within us that ultimately give us the ability to have the relationship. But on a fundamental level, the key thing that is the Shema that he's talking about now is to understand that existence and creation and creator are infinitely apart, and God is not affected by us. We'll soon understand the significance of this, because once you know this, you start realizing that the reality of God is far, far more superior than our reality. And the goal is to impress the animal soul that your reality, as much as you have pleasure in it, is temporary, is meaningless, relatively speaking, or even more than relatively speaking, and is almost like nonsensical when you're dealing with a reality like God's. So understanding that God is so different than us is actually helps us have a relationship with God in a real way with real bittul. So ultimately, even though those Mekubalim wanted to say there was a relationship between Yesh Miyesh, but that relationship would still be God on our terms. Whereas the Yesh Ma'ayin relationship is having a relationship with God on God's terms, as we shall discuss. And that's ultimately where he's going here. That's why he's emphasizing that it's not like Yesh Miyesh, because he wants to say that we are a relationship with God and it ultimately leads to a total bittul, because you realize our existence on its own terms. We're not talking about the godly kavanah in existence. We're talking about existence itself, matter itself. What is matter without energy? Even on a physics level, matter is nothing without energy. It's simply energy that's congealed into matter. And even more so, infinitely more so, is how existence is in context of godliness. That's what Yesh Ma'ayin ultimately teaches us. So it's not just teaching us that God is so beyond us that it's teaching us, that's teaching us what true reality is. So in a way, you could say in earlier generations, our relationship with God was, yes, God was greater than us, but we weren't, the Hamoyin Am, let's put it this way, mainstream was not taught about that this God is completely, completely beyond, like we're learning right now here. So that's somewhat of a little more context with that. And if I'll be happy to take any questions, but I will then also ready to go continue on here. Okay.
I was wondering if you could explain, the Rebbe here is saying that when it's yesh miyesh, there's a shinoi in the original yesh. But you mentioned it today briefly in your recap that what we learned with mayim, for example, the difference between mayim and light. A lot of discussion I am based was about the difference in shemish and light, that there was no shinoi in the shemesh from the ore. The ore was just a natural product as opposed to water that when you take shefa, the water is reduced in the source, but there's no change in the shemesh. I was just wondering, how does that fit in? You mentioned it, but could you elaborate how that it goes with the fact that all the Rebbe is stating that there's always a shinoi and yesh when it's yesh and yesh
Yeah.
about the things?
Yes, I will. So firstly, the fact that there's no change in the sun is actually a gift given to us by God to give us an example of Leishanisi in our existence. But I would challenge anyone to find anything in existence, that one thing that shapes another, that the first thing is not affected by that relationship. So Shemesh, and that's why he indeed gives all the examples. He gave, as I said, 4 different examples. We will learn that Oyer gives us an example, even though it's not mamish the same. It's an example. But the material world, by definition, is relationship oriented. And relationship means there's always a give and take. So if something is giving you, it in some way is impacted by that. Think cross-pollination of the bees and the nectar as they feed the flowers. Talk about all the symbiotic relationships between everything in our ecosystem. Everything is affected by everything else. A mashpia makabel. So there is no reality that doesn't have that case. As a matter of fact, I don't know what law it is in thermodynamics. I think it's the first or the second, or one of the laws of thermodynamics is that any energy that's transferred from one state to another has to deplete the first state. And basically, it's always the same balance. You never create any new energy. So it's either energy, maybe it's being converted into matter, or matter into energy, just a matter of which form it takes. But it's always never going to disappear, which tells you that it's constantly being shifted from one to the other, because there's nothing that's removed. Existence basically means everything in existence relates to each other. And especially when you go into quantum mechanics and modern physics, where we know today how every part of the universe is affected by every other part. And there's what do they call spooky movement at a distance. That's what it was called by the early physicists, and still use that expression. That for some reason, you can have 2 subatomic particles that are so distant that are affected faster than the speed of light, which in terms of physics is considered absurd and ludicrous, because nothing is faster than the speed of light. Speed of light is the very parameter of existence. So there's some type of relationship between everything, which means everything is giving and taking. Sometimes it's very apparent. I pour you a cup of water, obviously I'm going to have less water. A teacher is not going to become less brilliant because he teaches, but he's going to become he's going to definitely become more tired. You throw a stone, yes, you can get your energy back, but you have to invest in it. So there's almost no scenario. I would say there is no scenario that there isn't some shinui in his pilots. Now, again, it's a question of measure. You know, when water is heated and turns to gas, yes, it's no longer liquid. The liquid is no longer there. You can't drink it. And if it's frozen into ice, again, it changes. So the concept of change is I would say, inherent to material existence. The idea that there is no change is only possible, frankly, with God, because it's the only thing that's completely separate and apart. But he gave us one example of it in Oyer HaNefesh and Oyer HaNeshama and Oyer HaShemesh. And we will learn that soon. If you may recall, we learned it in Ayin Beis. But when he gave the example of the sun and the moon, the main focus there was to show that there's something in common. And where I qualified was that the Shinei Spilus may not be apparent there. But if you ask scientists, by the way, they say even the sun is affected by the light it gives off, and that's why they say the sun is getting weaker. It's just going to take a lot more time. The challenge is, from our point of view, chazakim kiyem ibarim, that God put into the sun an infinite type of power. But that's godly. But even according to science, even the sun is depleting as we speak. It's just that they consider it's going to take a few million years because it has so much, power to still deplete. Has so much fuel, so to speak. But even the sun, you could argue. So why does Chassidus bring that Eir Hashemis doesn't have a shini? That's because God made the sun that way, not because on its own that way. The sun doesn't have any divine power like that of its own to not be affected. That's briefly how I would explain this.
But when you brought up that point, just to continue with that, spooky action at a distance, which Einstein was coined that term, spooky action at a distance. I thought that's an example of that there is no shinoi in the there's a relationship, but there's no shinoi because they can be distant of millions of, I read millions of miles away. I mean, even sun,
And so what means so why do we have a problem if there's no change? The whole problem is because they affect each other.
That's what I mean. They affect each other without
affect means a change.
I thought that's what's spooky about it, that there's no
No,
change.
it's spooky that it's happening so quickly, faster than the speed of light. That's what's the spooky part.
What's spooky is that the two particles that are millions of miles away from each other can
have an effect.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point.
But not because they don't have an effect. If they don't have an effect, there's no problem.
I know they have an effect, but my question is not that they have an effect.
Effect means shinui and aspilas. That's what effect means.
Well, we just said that they give this, you're talking about the sun not being affected.
That's because of God, because God gave it that, not because the sun itself is being depleted according to science. Every ray of light that it gives off makes it weaker. It's so powerful, we don't sense it, but it's still, that's what every scientist will tell you. And we also believe that it's only because God gave it a power, so to speak, to be as strong as it was when it was first created and to be a muscle for Eir. Anyway, as I said, show me anything in existence that has a relationship to a husband and wife. Is there an effect of one or the other? If there isn't, it's achavei to their relationship. The whole point of a relationship is that if one affects the other, that means a relationship. If your child tells you, you know what, I feel you have no shinui aspilas from me, that's not a compliment.
Then isn't that the paradox that we are?
I'm not sure what you're trying to. I don't. Can you give me an example of something besides the light of the sun, which I said comes from God's power that is not affected by something else in this world? Everything. And look at the gravitational pull. Everything exerts gravity. Everything exerts energy. A magnet. I mean, wherever you go, one thing affects another. I come closer to you. My heat affects you. There's nothing in existence that doesn't affect each other.
Except our relationship to God, because Ani Hashem.
No, I'm not talking about God. We're talking about Yeshmi. We're talking about existence now.
All right.
God is another story. We're not talking about God. You're talking about existence.
Rabbi, since this is, I'm sorry, Eliezer, would you like to continue? Rabbi, since you're doing such a broad review, which is phenomenal, like I'm going to listen to this whole class again. Since you're already there, can you just briefly, the issue that we talked about, is there any change at all? And then I think it was the Rebbe Rashab who kind of come back and said, well, no, but kind of yes, meaning like we can be mispal, like Malchus can be mispal by our davening, for example. And although we can't directly affect the Eberster, we can change some disposition in Malchus, and Malchus can elevate higher and affect, I think we said even Kesser, maybe, ultimately. And in that sense, there was some kind of effect, but it was kind of secondary. It wasn't a direct impact. But can you just briefly go over that?
You asked that question back then, if you recall.
Here we go. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
And I also corrected you then the way I'm going to correct you now, which is, it's not yes and no effect and maybe yes. That's not at all what was said. Let me just clarify that, just for the record. The key two things you have to keep in mind. If any effect happens on any level, it's because God wants it to have an effect, not because it has to have an effect. That's the key difference. We're talking about now creation. The properties of existence have nothing in common with God except that God created them. If they are to have any effect, it's because God said, I chose that you do a mitzvah. And when you do a mitzvah, you're going to affect me. We'll soon discuss where that effect happens. So that's number one. It's not because we have anything in common. It's because God shows it. Like I said in the previous class, when you asked the question about what do you mean? And the neshama is a chelik elokam mamash. We're creating the divine image. So we have something in common. So as I explained, two things. One is that's God's choice. That's not because creation is a partner with God and it has something in common, because God decided to put into creation something of his own nature, so to speak. Number two, when he did so, he did it on levels that are lower levels. And that brings me to the second point. And I'll give you the page exactly where it's discussed. Maisa Tachtenim. And he makes it very clear, and I pointed out to you then as well. I don't know if you ever looked it up. But if you go back to page 1429, where he talks about the Shinui, so he says it's Dafke and Malchus. And there's the long discussion. He asked exactly that question. That on page 1428, he asked, how could you say there's a Shinui? Ashni Hashem le'shanisi. And he addresses at length. So I would tell you just simply to read those pages again. And then he says a key line. He says, I'm not looking where the line is exactly, that, let's see here.
On 1429?
1428, 1429 is what the general theme. Then there's one more thing I want to point out, where he says that if there's a Shinui, it's mitzad avodah. That has nothing to do with creation. We're talking about creation now. Once there's avodah, Hashem said, I'm giving you my power.
An opportunity, yeah.
Right. An opportunity to have a relationship with me. Even that needs to be explained, because at the end of the day, Atzmos is beyond Shinui. So how do you explain that? So that's where he goes into that affects Malchus, and Malchus opens the door that higher levels should so-called flow from there, as he explains there, to reconcile that issue.
Thank you. I'll go back and read it. I'm sure I did look at it, but as you see, my memory's not good, but I'll read it again.
No, it's fine. I will tell you right now, this is a topic that takes a long time to wrap your head around. It's not easy at all. So I'm not surprised at all. I'm surprised that everybody else doesn't ask the question in this class. But that's a different discussion. I'm trying to find that line, a very, very powerful line. It says, that's beside Aveda. That I remember he said. The left side of the page. Anyway, let's...
Did he use the word Shinui? Is that what you're remembering?
No, you're not going to find it, because it's not a key
Is
word.
that obvious?
I'll find it, don't worry. I remember it very well. I just don't remember exactly what page it's on. And the effects of the Shinui, with Shinui. It may even be later, now that I'm thinking about it. Okay. I want to go back to where we are, because we're going a little off. Let's see here. Yeah, I think it's later, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Oh, yeah. Bottom of page 1471. Yeah. Actually, the second half of 1471.
Is there one line there that you were talking about?
Yeah, he says, Kol zer b'ma'aseh ten b'aveidosem, aval bein hisavis ein shum shinui v'hispilus klal, gam ba'aretz hamalchus. 5 lines from the bottom of the page. We literally addresses this point. You see it?
1471?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Aval be'inyan ha'ishavas ein shum shinui v'hispilus klal gam b'haretz hamalchus shenase moker mamash l'biyah ad asiyah hagashmius. Yeah.
Mamish in this union with the philosophers and everything. But read off also a few lines before that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Let me go back to where we're up to now. So let's keep in mind here. Okay. Yichud yesh ma'ayin. Yesh ma'ayin. So I'm going to continue learning bottom of page 375. So he says like this. that all these kashas that we talked about are all according to the philosophers, but the truth is, be'emes, ein arech klal, be'emes, if sheshi yisavas habriya derech ze klal, yeah, creation had to happen in a way that is infinitely distant. So that means, even though God chose to also create mamala kalalman, meaning koyach hapoel benifel, he doesn't remain removed. He rakia, and he invests, the producer invests his energy into the production, but that is a certain dimension. Fundamentally, he remains still infinitely apart. That doesn't change anything. It just means he wants to also apply himself more. So he continues, he says, the fourth line, the new paragraph on page 375. It is, you can find the page at ayinbeis.com. In other words, there has to be some leap, some paradigm shift, some quantum leap between the two. That's why you could say that from Bli Gvul was created Gvul. Because if there's something in common, how does suddenly Bli Gvul become Gvul? So you have to say there's a leap. And that's the leap. That Musa Leki Lias Muhusa Nivroim. So what's the leap? So he's not giving from his very essence into creation. It's only coming from a reflection of his. And that's that leap. So if when you give, for example, yesh miyesh, a child is born from parents, from the very DNA and genes of the parents. A teacher and a student, even though the teacher doesn't create the intelligence of the student, but he's giving him of his intelligence. What he said, the example of shefa, all levels of shefa. Oir. I'm sorry, not like oir. Shefa, like water. Or any other type of spa. So there's an element of relationship, and therefore there's some shin in his spouse, there's some effect, something in common. Here it's coming through oir. And that's this hamshacha from the Bodily to the Nivra is coming in a form of reflection. B'shem, and that's why it's called b'chinas ha'or v'ziv, b'shem ma'ayin liyesh v'lo yesh miyesh. So since it comes to the state, b'shem ma'ayin liyesh, called ma'ayin liyesh. So like the sun doesn't give us a piece of the sun, it's a reflection of the sun, the light of the sun. V'lo yesh miyesh, and not yesh miyesh. The b'chinas ha'oris er v'ziv zeh ein a nechshav v'mechuz v'atzmus alakis klal klal. This light and reflection is not considered anything at all from the very core essence of the divine, from Elokus. Elarak ziv v'heidu zive v'heidei hameir mina etzem. Only the reflection of the glory and only like the light and reflection of the etzem. So this comes to explain yet another topic, but it's also in the same topic, is that yesh ma'ayin and oir have something much in common. Because if you didn't have oir, you'd simply have one entity, God, and now here's the creation. How do they meet? So you could say kol yachol, God can do anything he wants. Poof. He created a creation. But since he wants it to make sense, so, and we know it's not yesh miyesh because the creation has nothing in common with the creator. So we say he created a type of thing called an expression, a reflection. And that's the oir. Oir is manifesting divine power, but it's not the divine essence. And that's why the oir does not have any impact on him. And yet the oir is carrying the divine energy to creation. So he says that's type of relationship is a yesh ma'ayin relationship, not a yesh miyesh relationship. That's what he added here right now. So oir ends up becoming an important piece in understanding this to some extent. Okay. Any questions on this last few lines that we read?
I want to ask something a little esoteric. When he talks about this extension of light as or sort of as a means of expression or communication or activity, if you will, we also have the idea of revelation from concealment, meaning the light is it's not that it wasn't there and he's putting it there; it's always there, and we're revealing it. I mean, is it? The question is, are we essentially creating, or we're participating in that communication? In other words, if a tree falls in a forest, do you hear it if you're not there? The expression is there, but we can only essentially be affected by it if we make some effort to be Megala the Or. Do you understand my question? So in a sense, all right, then I'll take it offline.
How does the question apply to what we're learning now? What?
Good question. Does it apply? Well, we're talking about trying to persuade the Nefesh Bahamas and the
but we didn't get to. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it's Yeshus, and so essentially you have to get the Yeshus to be Megala the Or. So that's the key. The Or's there, but Nefesh Elokis has to persuade the Nefesh Bahamas to be Megala the Or. It's just an idea that popped into my head. I don't know if it makes any sense at all.
Right now, what's relevant is the understanding of Yesh Ma'ayin. As I said, I'm focusing what the Mittler Rebbe is talking about now. You're processing a bit.
Yes, of course
I'm not.
Yeah.
Okay, so what the Mittler Rebbe is saying so far, and no, so you're fine to do it, but I just want to make sure no one's confused. The Mittler Rebbe basically said about Yesh Ma'ayin. Yesh Ma'ayin means there's nothing in common and there's no shinui, and Oir is the operative way of understanding that, because Oir is exactly that. There's no shinui in the source when it gives off light, and therefore creation is not coming from the etzem of the source, coming from a reflection of it. Now, obviously, Lamaila, it's not a reflection like we know reflections in physical existence, but it's a mashal that helps us understand that now human being by nature, because we are creatures, there's even though you can have an aloof person, you can have a person who's detached or dispassionate or whatever, but at the end of the day, we are affected by things. You know, whether we feel it or we show that we feel it or not, because that's who we are. Because that's a human being. If you're hungry, you're going to feel hungry because we have needs, and we have relationships. When it comes to Yesh Ma'ayin, it's a true infinite distance. So it's only coming because God's benevolence that He wanted to create. And therefore, the creation is not something that is a need of His, and therefore, something adds or something subtracts from Him. Like He said, Atuhu mishenivra elam, Atuhu achale nivra elam, Atuhu mishenivra elam, and Yeshem leishanisi. So this contemplation is critical for the Nefesh Habamis to understand. Basically, we're introducing a concept that's not a man-made concept. Because as long as you're working with man-made ideas or human intelligence, you will remain a yesh. Maybe a more refined yesh, maybe a more evolved yesh, but it's still a yesh. Like we learned earlier about science, you're ultimately learning about existence. You're learning about yourself, about your needs. So at the end of the day, it's only the Chochmah Lekis that teaches you about a reality that's not you. So that's why it's so critical that God and us not be anything in common. It actually makes this so beautiful. That's the whole point of having a true relationship with God. That's not on our terms. It's not about, oh, God, you need food, so God provided you with food. That's a relationship on your terms. And that's also a relationship with God. We say, Birchas HaMazon, thank you for the food. Thank you for giving me Baruch Shahakal Nia B'dvarei, B'er Mina Mizenas, B'er Mina Eitz, etc. But here we're talking about trying to understand Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. We're trying to understand Hashem Elokeinu here. We're not trying to understand ourselves and our needs, even in the context of God serving our needs. What is Hashem like? So this is what this is about. It's introducing to the human being, including to the animal soul, what is God like? And the first thing we need to know, He's not you. He's not like you. That's the key thing. Without that, you can't grow anywhere. Because that's the whole reason that I mentioned about the whole lengthy discussion I gave when I prefaced all of this with mikveh. If you remember, total bittul, why avodah zarah is such a great sin, because it's about you. Then it's not. If you want a God, you need to understand God is not you. If God is even a little like you, then you say, okay, fine, He's higher than I am, but I'm also somebody. So that type of utter bittul is not meant to annihilate us, as we're going to learn. It's actually meant to elevate us to the highest levels of yichud that we're going to be learning about. So that's if you want, a punchline of what we've been learning so far. But he's still in the middle of this. It's not finished. And now he goes on the parentheses. V'hainu. And here, if you recall what we learned in Ayin Bey, is going to be very helpful, because now he's going to bring the mashal of the Ir HaNefesh. If you remember, I'll point out where this is. On top of page 1468 in Ayin Beis, he said, not only the etzem is not affected by creation, but also the Ur is not affected. Made it very, very clear. And he said, but what about, you see, the nefesh ha'adam is affected, mispal, the mikre aguf, that the pain of the body causes pain to the soul. So now he's going to go into that area of discussion. First, talk about the Ir HaNefesh that's not affected, but then going to make the distinction that there are levels that are affected. That's, if you remember, that was pages 1468, 1469. So Mittler Rebbe is going into that discussion now. But these are all examples in our lives to help understand and get a sense of how it is Lamaila by Hashem. I'll just add one more thing, which just helps address some of your questions and also to anticipate further questions. When you look Chassidus, the thing is that all of you have learned Siches and Maamorei, and of course you've learned so much about how God wants and needs us, so to speak. Like, the Dira B'Tachtenim, the mitzvahs we do, and we talk about us having a relationship with Hashem. So when you learn this, it seems to contradict it initially, because here suddenly we're learning that we have nothing in common with Hashem. So then what does it mean to be a chosen people? And what does it mean that we're God's agents in this world? So you have to keep in mind that in some ways we've been spoiled, because we've already heard all of Chassidus through the words of the Rebbe and through our teachers that taught us about our relationship with Hashem. But if you really go back to the basics of Chassidus, before we talk about a relationship, you have to talk about this idea that God is completely superior to us. And that's sometimes less focused on, because in our generation, we talk a lot about our shlichus in this world, to go out there and bring God everywhere. But in truth, to really bring God everywhere is to understand that God's reality is beyond our reality. So it's not a contradiction, it's just two different parts of the discussion. Right now, the point of is to demonstrate that God's reality is nothing in existence is real without God. God is the only true emes. That's not meant to negate us. It's actually meant to empower us. That your true emes is not what you think it is, because you have a big ego or because you have talents and skills. It's because God said, my true emes I've given now to you to bring to the world. That's the key thing to keep in mind when it comes to that, balancing those two ideas. And if you recall, we learned about Yichud Tata, Yichud Ilah, and the Yichud of both of them. Why do we need all those? Because at the end of the day, you can't get to Yichud Ilah if you don't get to Yichud Tata. You need all levels of bittul here. But ultimately, the goal is to realize that all of existence is simply an extension of godliness, like we concluded in Ayin Beis. But you can't get there. First, you have to understand what godliness is, what existence is. So Yesh Ma'ayin is actually a language. And it took me a long time to actually wrap my head around. I always used to think when we were taught Yesh Ma'ayin, that it was all about ex nihilo, creation ex nihilo. Creation of something from nothing. And yeah, fine, that's a great concept. Bereishis bara, nothing else is, only God is the creator, created something from nothing. Everything else is something from something, and so on. It's only when you start learning Chassidus at length, you start realizing That's not the point. Yes, it's a point, obviously, that God's the creator. The real point is that God is infinitely apart from us. That's why it's Yesh Ma'ayin. That's what it wants to teach you. That you and God are not in the same, you're not partners. Then God makes you a partner afterwards. But the point being is that there's this appreciation of a higher state of reality that's completely beyond us. Recently I was speaking to a guy. He's a shtickle expert, if you wish, on what they call plant medicine today, or psychedelics, or hallucinogens, whatever you want to call it. And he told me about I've read about it. I'm familiar with the DMT and what they call ego death. Ego death. That's the name they use, ego death. That there's some very, very powerful from a toad in Arizona, a certain excretion, a certain secretion that the toad releases. That when you take that, it's a very quick experience. It's just minutes long, but it completely, you feel no ego death. And I said to him, I opened up one of these Maamorei, and I said to him, here it is, long before the toad. We have it specifically in Chassidus. And I said, what did you learn from it? He said, you learned that you don't exist. There's only a higher reality. You're nobody. You don't exist, period. And I said, and you were able to integrate that in your life afterwards? He says, well, that's the challenge, because the ego comes back. So my point that I was making is that this is what Chassidus is really saying. This is not advocating any type of foreign substances, for the record. Actually, quite the contrary, that all these things can be experienced in Shema Yisrael without any toads and without any altered states induced by outside forces. The point being is that there's the concept where you are experiencing Lifnei Tzimtzum, where really there's no room for Eilamus Klal. That's what that Arizal says. It's only godliness. Now, we know that you can't just go there and stay there, because we do exist and we cannot blow our circuits to the point where we get annihilated. So it has to be done step by step. But ultimately, the idea of that type of level of understanding that God is reality and we're not is the beginning of what Yesh Ma'ayin is coming to really teach us. On the language, Elikus b'pshitus, elam is b'schatshus, chidush. Because Elikus is the reality, and existence is a chidush, Yesh Ma'ayin. Instead of how we see it, that existence is pshitus, is reality, and God is a chidush, where then God is Yesh Ma'ayin. Like, we're the reality, and God is that option, like the story I often tell about the debate between, I like to call it the philosopher and the chassid, where they're talking about the existence of God, and God, back and forth, they're debating it. Finally, the chassid who gets so frustrated, he says to him, I envy you, because you think about God all the time, and I think about myself all the time. So the philosopher goes away feeling very flattered by this great chassid, and he's bragging to others. He says, the big chassid complimented me. He thinks about himself, I think about God, till one day he's enlightened, or somebody enlightens him, that the chassid actually was insulting you. He was saying, you think about God all day because you exist. That's a given. You don't have to think about it. So your question is, does God exist? And if yes, where is he, and how, and what, and when? Trying to prove it. For the chassid, the opposite is true. That God exists is a given. His question is then, does he exist? So he thinks about himself all day. Am I here? Am I not here? If I am here, what's my purpose? And so on. Now, we know it's not just semantics. This is the difference between Yesh Ma'ayin and Yesh Miyesh, basically. Or you could say Yesh Ma'ayin the other way around, that we're the Yesh and God is the unknown, or the other way around, that God is the reality and we are infinitely distant. So a little more oasis in understanding this level of contemplation of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, and Hashem Echad. Okay. So now he says in the parentheses, he's going to give the Eir HaNeshama. He's going to talk about the Eir HaNefesh. V'hainu, this Eir that we're talking about, that does not affect the source, and it's only a reflection of him. So like the expression or the reflection and the vitality that comes from the etzem nefesh. So we know a nefesh is the soul that has the power to give life and infuse and imbue and energize and bring a body to life. After 120, the body is just without a life force. So it gives the chayes to the guf. So he says, "Shenimshech lahachis haguf," that this energy coming from the etzem nefesh is coming lahachis haguf to energize the body. She'ein zeh memuchus v'atzmus hanefesh. This energy that's coming from the soul is not from the muhus and atzmus hanefesh. It's like bechinas gili levad. It's not like the nefesh itself is being transferred. It's the energy of the nefesh. It's like when you say the energy of the sun, the light of the sun. It's not the sun itself remains where it is. So it's only a gili levad. U'kumay be'erva ziv hashemesh, like the light and reflection of the sun. Hameir la'aretz u'ledarim allow that radiates and illuminates the earth and to those that dwell on the earth, the citizens of this earth. Shalo yipel b'zeh shini b'moyer hashemesh atzmei. This does not cause any change in the sun itself. That's why when it's a cloudy day and the light is unable to reach the earth, it doesn't change. The sun is not affected. Bein achara ora zu ay behestader. There's no change whether it's after the reflection or whether the reflection behestader or whether the reflection is being concealed or covered up. That's in the shemesh itself. V'gam ba'ir, v'gam be'igilei zeh ein shinei klal. Not just the sun doesn't change, but the oir itself also doesn't change. The light that's shining, let's say, in a cloudy day, that reaches the earth through a cloud, meaning it's somewhat gray day. It's a gray day. You don't see the full light. That's only from our perspective. The light itself is exactly the same light, whether it's cloudy or not cloudy. Going now back to the nimshal. There's no difference in the Eir HaChayes HaRuchni. I'm sorry, to the nefesh. She said the shemesh, now back to the nefesh. There's no difference in the Eir HaChayes HaRuchni, in the ethereal or ephemeral Eir. Of vitality. Ben Kedim Shemachaya, then before it extends to energize, Shemachaya, Ben Kedim Shemachaya, La'achar Shemachaya. No difference in before giving the energy off or after it energizes. If for whatever reason this vitality from the nefesh does not energize one particular organ, limb, and it leaves it for whatever reason, there's an injury, for example, or whatever reason it's not able to enter into that limb, it does not affect. Take the power of vision. If you close your eyes or you're asleep, or for whatever reason your eyesight is impaired, God forbid, or blurred, the energy that's flowing from the soul to your eye doesn't change. It's just unable to affect you and therefore unable to, you don't see properly. But that doesn't mean that the earth is affected in any way. There's no shinu klal. And continuing on, it's all a parentheses. Now, parentheses within a parentheses. V'gam, keiches hanefesh, and also the faculties of the soul. Ba'arasam begilui, when they illuminate, they reveal in a revealed way. Sheyuchlu ba'atzmis hanefesh, when they get encompassed, meaning they return back into the atzmis hanefesh. Ein shinu klal be'etzem hanefesh, shanefesh achasi. Let me see what that means. I know in Ayin Beis he explained that line, but let me see how he says v'gam keches hanefesh ba'arasam begilui. Okay. So he's saying these faculties, when they actually manifest and revealed, the way they're encompassed in Atzmis Nefesh, there's no Shini Klal in Atzma Nefesh. So just like the faculties and the oir does not change if there's some type of some whatever reason the limb cannot receive that oir, so etzem nefesh also doesn't change based on the oir that comes from it, because it's all one nefesh. The nefesh is one entity that's not affected or changed by any of these experiences. V'raya, he brings a proof for this. Mahal Gilgulim, from reincarnation. So Gilgulim literally means like cycles. Gilgulim from the word like cycles, that the concept that nefesh returns, if it hasn't finished its job, it returns to this world. So he says, Shenefesh Adam Bar Das. So you have a situation, tragically, where the soul of a human being returns of a Bar Das, an intelligent human being, Mizgalgelas be'even, a behema, ends up in a stone or in an animal. Nefesh achasi. And the nefesh remains one and intact. It doesn't change. It's just trapped. So it's like taking a human being and putting them into a sack. So the person still remains a person. But now you can't, there's no movement. You are encumbered. You are being stuck. Okay? But the nefesh itself does not change. That's what he says here. Now, to really understand this piece, especially what he's going to say afterwards, I think we're going to have to go back to Ayin Beis, because Ayin Beis elaborates about this a lot more and helps us understand it on literally page 1468. But I'm going to read it in the Mitla Rebbe's Maamor first, and then we'll go back to Ayin Beis, because there may be some things that are going to be not so clear, because the Mitla Rebbe's language is a lot more concise and sometimes jumps. It's not that easy, for me at least, to understand. The Rebbe Rashab, on the other hand, smooths a lot of things out. So let's first see what he's going to say here. So far, this parentheses, I want to see also where this parentheses ends. Anybody see the end of this parentheses?
No, there's another parenthesis with the parenthesis. Unless they forgot to close it, there's yet another.
Yeah, there's probably forgot to. We already found that before, that he forgot to close some parentheses. Forgot, or maybe the Ksav Yad, whatever. Let me just see here. Do you see any ends or only beginnings?
I don't see any ends, Rabbi.
Oh boy, so no end to this? Because also this is already a second parenthesis that has...
Yeah, no, I don't see it. And I'm already on to 378.
Okay. I'll find it. One thing is clear. Is where it began. We'll be able to figure it out. I'm not concerned. I think okay, we'll continue on. The thing is like this now. He's now going to go back and say, on the other hand, we have a concept that the neshama is affected by the experiences of the body, which of course contradicts what we just learned. So this is where the Ayin Beis will come into play, that there are two levels. Like I spoke before about godliness, there's also God as he manifests within existence, there's God beyond. So now he's going to go sack. He says, "V'im kol zeh." The truth is, I'm thinking maybe I should stop here, but let me just say it already. Let's take the plunge. Nevertheless, even though we just established from the parentheses that Ur does not affect the etzem, and more than that, the Ur being nimshach to the recipient doesn't affect the Ur, like you just established, and both in the sun and in the nefesh. But now, im kol zeh, there's something unique with the nefesh. Hari nefesh maspa'eles memikre haguf. There's an expression that the soul is impacted, is affected. Mikre is experiences of the body. Kamoi, the kilkul, the evri haguf. If there's any injury or wound to the limbs of the body, targish hanefesh b'ke'ev, the nefesh will feel pain. The yitzar lenefesh, and there'll be tzar. The nefesh will feel anguish. Hagam shemushlalis mikol teirei aguf. Even though a nefesh is completely negates and repels, defies, I should say, is better. All teirei aguf, all descriptions of all bodily descriptions. A nefesh has nothing physical about it. The power to see has nothing physical about it, in the sense like the eye itself. The ein bo shinui klal, and there's no change at all, like we said before, from the way it was before it entered the body. So what's going on here? So then why do we feel pain? And remember, pain can't be body pain because a dead person doesn't feel pain. That means the nefesh is feeling something. So we're compelled to say that both are true. The kasher yorda nefesh v'nislapsha b'dam u'basar. Then when this nefesh, the spirit descended and manifested in the blood and flesh. Hari b'dam atzmei hu nefesh haruchnius kiyadua. In this very dam, the blood is not detached. Dam hu nefesh, like what we learned, and if you may remember, and I am basically discussed this as well. Straight from here. That the ruchnius kiyadua. Umavur b'kosuv. Like it's known and it's explained in the verse, Betam Isur Achilas Dam, in Parsha A, in Chumash, Sefer Dvarim, it talks about why eating blood is forbidden. B'mashikosav le'seichel ha'nefesh im ha'bosar. You shall not eat nefesh. What's nefesh? He says, Damu ha'nefesh. You shall not eat the spirit in the blood with the flesh itself, with the meat. That's why we sold the meat, etc. So what do we see from that? That the nefesh doesn't remain just an ethereal entity. It's become the blood itself. And that's why we're not allowed to eat the blood. V'nikra Ruchnius She'Bgashmius. This dam is called Ruchnius She'Bgashmius. It's not Gashmius She'Bgashmius. It's not the veins itself and not the physical, but it's the spirit, so-called, you could say, the Ruchnius within Gashmius. Yidua. And that does not have anything in common. It's not ein la'erech. It's infinitely apart from the gashmis of the ruchnis. That's the neshama, the nefesh, as it's beginning to take on shape, be able to enter into the blood. That is be'etzem, the spirit of the soul, before it comes into the body. So you have the Ruchnius She'Bgashmius, that's the nefesh. You have Gashmius She'Bgashmius is the body. The Ruchnius, the Gashmius She'Bruchnius, meaning the soul as it's being prepared to relate to the Ruchnius She'Bgashmius, which is the blood, is where the relationship happens. That's the interface. And I discussed this at length when we learned Ayin Beis. So it's an interface, that's the way God made it. So he's explaining that the effect of the pain on the body, on the soul, is going to be in the lower levels, not in the higher levels. Let's just continue reading and you'll see where it goes. Okay. The af mashiyesh b'keach hayizgalus v'yispashus lahachiyus kol geshem. So even though we say the nefesh has the power to reveal itself and express itself, to energize kol geshem, every physical thing, v'nikra gashmius she'Bruchnius, because you could have a nefesh that is so apart from anything in this physical world. It's like think electricity has to have a relationship with the appliance that is going to energize. So therefore, it's called gashmius she'Bruchnius l'mayla, v'nikra gashmius she'Bruchnius l'mayla, hu gavoya harba minefesh she'melubeshes she'murkevas b'dam. So even that level is still higher than the way the nefesh goes into the dam, which is the Ruchnius She'Bgashmius. So the Ruchnius She'Bgashmius is lower than the Gashmius She'Bruchnius. That's what he's saying here. Im kain. And so, if so, Mitzat She'Bruchnius zeh She'Bgashmius haguf So Ruchnius She'Bgashmius Haguf, the dam that is, Nivdelis Kfar Mina Atzmus HaRuchnius the Nefesh is already separated and apart from the core spirit of the soul. Being that is murkav, it's a composite of the four elements, physical elements, the basar v'dam, of the flesh and blood, to spoil him mikri haguf b'tzara enig. So that part of the nefesh, the God Ruchnius She'Bgashmius, that is affected by the pain or pleasure of the body. Shetzar haguf hutzar hanefesh, the pain of the body is the pain of the soul. And the pleasure, physical pleasure of the body also becomes the pleasure of the soul, but it's the lower level of the soul. The enig of this spirit of the soul is like a physical enig. Medam machmas simchas hanefesh umepsura, simchas hanefesh. To the point, he's now saying the opposite. So just like physical pleasure affects spiritual pleasure affects physical pleasure. Now, when a person hears good news, his very flesh becomes pleasure, misaden, enriched, enjoyable pleasure. Like when a person hears good news, like the Gemara says, that he became emperor of Rome, his foot swelled. Tishnashin etzem, his very bone swelled. V'yitzavo ponov, and his face lit up, was glowing from the blood due to the joy that he had. So we see that when you hear good news, which is not a physical thing, it can have a physical impact on the person. And the same opposite, from bad news, ponov roim, a face becomes very, let's call it roim ponov, a face becomes pale or downcrest, crestfallen. The nilka bedam, and the dam, so to speak, is drawn out of it. Ad sheyichla haguf, to the point the body can get ill. So we see now the impact, but this is only on the soul as it relates to the body, not the soul as it's removed from the body. That's at a higher level. And the same is when a person strikes a body, God forbid, the koyach kemachad bebasar hachai, that something either wounds or injures the body, kemachad bebasar hachai, like you stick a needle in the flesh of an animal, yitzar benefesh b'murgish gadol. The nefesh will have great pain with the b'murgish gadol, means very deeply feel, strongly feel the pain, Shekol zeh meira, all this indicates kesher v'chibur haruchnius begashmis, on the bond and the connection between Ruchnius and Gashmis, v'hoyu lachodim mamish, to the point that they become like one. Shelo yitaken lemer be'ela klal b'nefesh haruchni atzma. You can't say any of this on the nefesh itself. You can only say it on the nefesh as it relates to the body through the dam. That part of the nefesh remains removed and is not affected from the pleasure and the pain of the body, of the physical pain, pleasure and pain. But kol sibas haguf mitevera canal, and all the impact and all the causes of good for the good or for the negative, as mentioned above. V'chein loy tispal nefesh b'basar the dam ha'enig eitzar. And the same as the nefesh in the flesh and the blood does not get affected by the pleasure or pain. Ruchnius She'Bgashmius nefesh. The other way around as well. That which is happening in the etzem nefesh does not affect the way the nefesh is in the flesh and blood. Shebilti melubeshes klal b'guf, that part of the soul that doesn't at all manifest inside the body. And here comes yet another parenthesis. There are only things at times. There are times that you have some type of experience like that the lev knows the bitterness of the heart. That sometimes the lev will sense, your physical heart will sense some deeper pain of the higher levels of the soul. And same thing with the pleasure. But it's not a common thing. He's saying there are exceptions where the physical part of the soul within the body will feel and sense something from a much higher place. However, bispilus enig v'tzar belakus b'neshama yargish gam b'nefesh habamis kanal. The pleasure and pain in the godliness of the soul, a nefesh habamis will feel. And this is where you see he's trying to go back to the theme of the effect on the nefesh habamis, because the whole point of this is to understand how godliness of Hashem Shema Yisrael affects the nefesh habamis. So he's saying, now the nefesh habamis will be affected. We see the love of God that the Yetzer Hara also can have. So the Mittler Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab did not do this in Ayin Beis. Mittler Rebbe is giving us already a hint of where this is going. That ultimately, the same as Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Habamis can appreciate godliness, even though initially they're two diametric opposites. So that's why this is so relevant, this whole piece. So he's saying there's two things that are working here at once. Shnei Memes. There's a level of soul that's beyond effect, but there's a level of soul where there is an effect, both ways. The body affecting the soul and the soul affecting the body, like he just elaborated.
Beautiful. I think that's where the original parentheses ends too, by the way.
Well, there's two parentheses that have to end. So I have to
That's
really
true.
look into.
Yeah.
We have to look into this. Maybe they both end here. It's possible. They can't end earlier because this is all part of the theme of the
one
nefesh.
idea, right? Exactly.
Right. So they can't. They definitely can't end earlier. The question is, if one. Let me see this. The second one. The second one said. Let me see here. The first one was this nefesh.
I think your instinct is right. The double closure. That's my instinct. But I have a question when you're done trying to figure that out.
Just a second. One second. Give me a second. 1 minute, please. I think the second parentheses ends on line 2, at the end of line 2. That's what I would say. The im kol zeh is not connected to the second parentheses. That's why. But I have to think it over. Okay, let me just sum it up in case we read a lot. But bottom line is, and I want to go back to Ayin Beis for sure because there's a lot of details here. Bottom line is, he began by saying that Yesh Ma'ayin does not affect the creator. It's only like Oir. The parentheses came to explain it with the mashal of the Eir HaNeshama. Also mentions Eir HaShemesh. Doesn't affect the source. Even the Oir is not affected. Good. But then there's another side. Remember, we wanted to affect the Nefesh HaBamis. Interestingly. So that's why he says there's another side to it, and that is that the pain of the experience of the body affect the soul. How do you reconcile that with the fact it's not affected? So he says, Shnei Memes. Both are true, depending which level. The soul that's completely Ruchnius, I think even Gashmius She'Bgashmius, that's not affected. But then there's the soul that becomes a Ruchnius She'Bgashmius, like the Dam, who are Nefesh. That is affected. That's the punchline here. And so too, with the animal soul, it is affected. Now, of course, the big question is, so what happens with the higher levels? Is it something we just learn about that God is removed from it all? If there's no effect, that I want to leave. We'll see where that goes later. But right now, that's definitely what he said here. That's a summation of end of this paragraph. And yes, I would say the end of the paragraph is the parentheses ends. The one that began 7 lines from the bottom of last page. The second parentheses, V'gam keich hanefesh, the last line I think ends 2 lines from the top of the page, would be my guess, but I want to guess, my educated guess, but I want to really look into make sure. I don't think they both end at the end. Because the second one is just a detail. That's keich hanefesh, but also begili. Yeah. It may even end at the first line, fine, now that I'm thinking about it, but I want to look into that more. Okay, I stop here. Questions?
One question I have is, I mean, first of all, this is just so incredibly, exquisitely beautiful if you think about it, to understand why your spirit, I mean, I say sort of your matzav ruach, like just the palabaktisha expression of the shama, like, you know, your countenance, how do you feel, your mood, if you will, how that's affected by things that happen in materiality. And my question, I'm just blown away by the beauty of this, but there's many implications of that. One question is, can you say, and this is very deep, but can you say that when, let's say, a person feels depressed, okay? Yeah, this is chassidus applied, and you can say I'm processing too much, but I'm going to ask anyways. You can say for another day. When a person, let's say, feels depressed because some circumstance in their life is not ideal, it could be whatever makes someone depressed. That's real, not imagined. Imagine that's a whole separate issue. But okay, so the spirit, the soul, if you will, is affected by that, and it feels it. You know, if you lose somebody, God forbid, or someone hurts your feelings, you love someone, they say they don't love you, whatever. You could make up 1,000,001 examples. Okay, so it's very real. It hurts. It's very real. But if you probe it deeply, you could say, okay, this is real, not denying it. But the reality is, what's happening here is that God made it so that the Nefesh Elokis could communicate with the Nefesh Bahamos, and ultimately to help them avar and to transform the Nefesh Bahamos, to do everything that we, you know, the Shnei Tzarecha, you should change in, to harness the power of the animal spirit and to elevate and to subjugate and to transform and improve all the ultimate goals of why we're here. That those feelings we have of depression, again, for example, or loss, are consequences of this structure that God made, that the primary purpose of which is to harness an Nefesh Bahamas and to connect with Elokus and to be one with God. And ultimately, if you are truly one with God, I mean, really, and I guess maybe only tzaddikim really get there, these things in the material world, they don't really affect the soul. You can understand it's sad. It's not going to affect your neshama. So when someone feels depressed, you can say, this is real. But the reality is, this is the way God made the soul, that if I can pierce through this materialism, I can realize it's a symptom of the way God built the connection between the body and the soul. And if I understand it correctly, it's tzarly, it's sad for me, it's hard for me, but I should really, in some sense, realize that if I channel Elokus more, I can actually transcend this depression, if you will. The same construct that's making me feel this way, I can use it to my advantage to overcome that feeling. Do you understand the question?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's more of, like you said, applied. It's not a question of what we're learning here.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's many, like you said, many implications about. I mean, remember, at the end of the day, we are looking to find interface ability of two realities that are so different, which is godliness. And the fact that the nefesh affects the body and the body affects the nefesh in both directions, and pleasure and pain and so on, gives us also tools to elevate our physical existence to a more spiritual state, and to bring down higher spiritual states into our physical existence. You know, I'm just saying in different words, but that is ultimately part of the application of this. And of course, that applies to the animal soul and divine soul very directly.
Yeah, it's just so beautiful. That's what he's written here.
Yeah, I just want to, because it's a class with everybody here, I want to just separate between applying this and going back to, if anyone has any questions on the very topic we learned right now. You know?
Yes, I do.
So Yitzchak always makes it very clear when it's not clear to him what we learned. When it is clear, that doesn't mean it's clear for everybody else either. So I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay.
Fair enough. You have the floor, Eliezer.
Yeah, I have a question. You had asked earlier in the class today that show me something in existence that has a relationship but doesn't affect say the giver, and says the source. But aren't we learning here just now that this highest level of nefesh is not affected
But that's
by?
elikus. But that's because of elikus. That's not because of physical reality. The nefesh itself is a spiritual entity.
But it's
You
not
know, that
Atzmus. It's not Atzmus. It's much
we're
lower
not
level.
talking about Atzmus. Atzmus is not even under discussion here. My point is, can you find something in the physical world that you and I can tangibly experience?
But the nefesh is
And
not.
why are you, let me ask you a question in return. Why are you trying to do that? I mean, like, why are you trying to force it? What are you trying to get to?
No, I'm just trying to understand this.
Yesh mi yesh is a real phenomenon in this physical world. Everything in this physical world has shefa, has relationships with each other. Is that a problem? I'm saying, do you have you want to not have it that way? That's the way God made it.
No, I want to have, of course. I'm trying to.
So there's
understand the paradox.
relationships means effect, that things affect each other. The guy
Except
you're
the
sitting
nefesh.
next to in shul, in your Rosh Hashanah seat, is going to affect you. That's how it is.
But isn't the nefesh a yesh?
I don't know. I'm not. This semantics to me. The nefesh. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not a yesh. Maybe it's inyan ruchni compared to Gashmi. It's inyan ruchni.
But Ruchnius is also yesh, isn't it?
So therefore, what? This is not a scientific discussion about yesh. This is a discussion that there are levels of the soul that are not affected, and there are levels of soul that are affected. The same thing that he wants to explain is that God is not affected, and there are lower levels. I'm not getting into godliness now. We have to see where he's going to go with that. But the theme of this mimer is to explain yesh ma'ayin, that God creating something is not affects him, whereas everything else that we know does get affected. So you're asking me, since God created a nefesh and the higher levels of the nefesh, what he calls etzem nefesh, are not affected, does that contradict what he's saying? Do you think so? Tell me. Obviously, it doesn't contradict, because that's talking about the higher level. Higher levels talking not affected. But when you talk about anything that's yesh mi yesh, ilav all cause and effect.
He said that even in the nefesh itself, there are two parts. There is the Gashmius She'Bgashmius, which is not connected. But there is the Ruchnius She'Bgashmius, which is connected.
Yeah.
There is one exception, that the nefesh elikis with the nefesh abamis, even though that this is two different things, this is the mafli latzis, because it is connected even to the nefesh abamis.
Yeah, but you could also say it means the nefesh elikis as it is the Ruchnius She'Bgashmius of the nefesh abamis, lav dafke the etzem of the nefesh elikis. He didn't say that, so you could make a case that the nefesh elikis, you're talking the lower levels. We'll see. Maybe I'll talk about that.
That's a good point, but it's not definite, because there's something in the nefesh elikis.
Well, it depends. When you say afal pishachoti, so there is a level of etzem haneshama, like chai yechida, is not affected by. That's why I want to go back, and Ayin Beis, he spoke about that. Anyway, but essentially, yes, we're in that. That's the ballpark here for sure. And so the point of not being affected, Eliezer, is coming to explain how God's is the absolute reality. So the same thing with the nefesh. The fact that there's a part of the nefesh that's not affected is not because it's detached and removed, is because it's a higher reality that's not affected by the experiences of the body, by the experiences of life below. It really is, I would say it's almost actually gives us hope, because it means like the pilot flame always remains burning no matter what's happening on Earth. So even when things seem like really difficult, we can always hold on to the amunah and connection to that level of nefesh that's not affected by a war in Gaza, for example, or by a Holocaust, or by other life experiences. At the
I think
same
that's what I
time,
was trying to say, by the way, Rabbi. What you just said is kind of what I was trying to say. You said it much better. Sorry for interrupting.
okay, that's fine. All good. No problem. I'm not taking points and credit here.
Okay, no,
Yeah.
I'm just saying you leaned into a little Chassidus applied too. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I'm not responding. So on the other end, there is where the nefesh is engaging with existence, and because we need to refine this world. It's not enough to escape into these higher places. You want to also refine the animal soul. You want to refine the body. You want the pains and joys of the body to affect the neshama, and the neshama to affect the pains of the. So I would wait till we also finish the whole subject. Go back to Ayin Beis, because he spoke about there in more detail to really get the whole picture here. But we will stop here, end of the paragraph on page 376. As you can imagine, I'm not afraid of Chassidus applied. I just like to keep the boundaries to know, what's pshat in the mimer, and then what's the application, so to speak.
100%.
And sometimes there's overlap, obviously, because when you apply it, it helps understand the subject too. It's not. We're fine. I'm perfectly comfortable. We haven't gone off the reservation.
Before we turn off the recording, I just want to make a quick announcement for the fundraising campaign for the publication of the new special edition of the Toward a Meaningful Life book. Rabbi Jacobson wrote his famous best-selling book that he's putting into 50,000+ copies to give to the Chayalim, the soldiers serving in the war in Israel. So instead of this annual fundraising campaign for his own organization, he's allocating any donations that we can make at the end of the year toward this publication effort, which is costing over $300,000. So please, if these classes are useful to you, they deliver value, this is an opportunity this year to say thank you, and by helping not Rabbi Jacobson, but the troops in Israel. So please give great thought. There's a link in the WhatsApp thread. I'll share it again. Please make a donation. It means a lot. And it doesn't matter what you give, $18, $54, $100, $180, whatever you can give. We're going for 100% participation. If you give 100, you get a free version of this, free copy of the special edition. If you give 180, you get a hand-signed version with a inscription from Rabbi Jacobson. So please, everybody go make a donation, and it should be mechazik, should give strength to the soldiers and help us overcome the evil they're confronting. Thank you all.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Amen for that. And with that, I will stop the recording here. End of paragraph, page 376.